We live by what can be seen. Actually, Paul says we do not live by what can be seen. We live by what cannot be seen. I think more, though, these days, it's sort of the first part. We seem to live most days preoccupied with all the things that we can see instead of the things that we cannot. We watch the stock ticker as our investments lose value and then gain value and then lose value again. We look at the newspaper, sometimes not actually reading it, but really just looking at it. We go to the movies and we look at the screen. We turn on the TV and we look at the screen. We turn on our computer or our cell phones or our digital cameras and we look at them and we look at our pictures and we look at our neighbors' yards and we look at our neighbor's new car or new boat or new TV. We follow the Packers or the Vikings up and down the field throughout football season. We watch our NASCAR driver drive around and around and around and around and around and around. He's making a left turn. He's making another left turn. Again and again, we look, we see. I think we feed on images and the beauty of things around us. The colors, the shapes, the textures, light, dark. We live by what we can see. But when it comes to divine things, the Spirit, for instance, God cannot be captured or known through these images. Whether it's a painting of what someone thinks God looks like or whatever we see in our own heads as we try to picture God and the Spirit. That's really the reason for the second commandment, to make no graven images. The forbidding of images in Jerusalem and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have the same rule. And even in the Protestant Reformation, many, many years ago, they looked against the Catholic Church's use of images and idols because they thought it broke that very important rule. We cannot put God into an image. We're not supposed to put God into an image, but we really, really want to. We want to see God. We want to see God at work around us and in us. But where is God? Where do we look? There is a Benedictine monk named Bede Griffiths. And Bede travels around the world to ask that simple question. Where is God? Obviously, if he's a Benedictine monk, his faith rests in the Christian tradition, but he does not limit his questions to those who share his faith. So when he travels to the east and he encounters Hindus and Buddhists and asks them, "Where is God?" they answer by pointing to their hearts. They believe that God, Creator, Almighty, whatever words they use, lives within each and every person. So when they're asked, "Where is God?" God is here. Now, when he travels through the West and he encounters Jews and Christians and Muslims and asks them, "Where is God?" we typically do what? Point up, toward the heavens where God resides. Where is God? Where do we look? Whenever we talk with others about the ways we see God at work in our lives, how often do we hear people try to explain it only by saying they can't fully explain it? Somehow there is a deep spiritual dimension to God's activity in our lives, so deep and so spiritual that we cannot put words to it. Celtic Christianity describes these experiences as thin places. The place where the distance between us and God seems thinner than normal. Times when we feel like there is another force at work, another sense almost, sight, smell, taste, touch. It's almost like a God sense. It feels different. It's a thin space. Have you ever thought of somebody right before the phone rang and they were on the other end? Or have you ever had a sinking feeling in your heart, I really need to reach out to this person, only to realize how desperate they are for someone to reach out to them? Have you ever woken up right before your alarm goes off? That's probably more our actual biological clocks, but it's the same idea. Or right before your baby begins to cry, do you wake? Remember Elijah, who heard a still, small voice, or Moses, who climbed a mountain to see God's glory. We can discover these thin places, God's presence all around us, if we do what Paul asks us to do, open our eyes and open our hearts to see. Poor Paul. Sometimes I really don't like what he has to say, and sometimes he really just hits it on the head. But Paul had a really difficult life. He had a life full of suffering and persecution, and eventually a very morbid death because of his faith in Jesus Christ. But in his suffering, he remained strong and faithful, and sometimes even rejoiced in the suffering he was experiencing, because, as he said, it was for the sake of the gospel. Many times his experiences of suffering have been used to encourage others to suffer, saying things like, well, if you suffer in your faith, you will be rewarded. And maybe that's true, but no one should ever suffer for the sake of suffering. When Paul talks about his sufferings and his rejoicing, he rejoices because his strength of faith is showing through his suffering. Every person in this life will encounter suffering of some kind, probably many times. Paul's words should encourage us to remain strong in the face of suffering, not because we rejoice in the suffering, but because we know that God is at work in the suffering. Even if we cannot see it or feel it, and maybe don't necessarily believe it in the midst of it, God is present in our suffering. Paul has confidence in this because he does not look around himself and look for encouragement from the things he can see with his own eyes. He finds his strength from the things that are unseen. What we can see, it fades, but what is unseen is eternal. From the beginning of Paul's ministry, he did not think he was going to live very long. He was pretty sure the minute he started working and living his life for the gospel, his life would be very short. Plus, he also believed that the Messiah was right around the corner, coming again for the second time in fullness and glory. So he did not expect the world as he could see it to exist much longer. We now see this new age that he talked about. Not with our eyes. We see it as our lives of faith take shape. We see it as we start to recognize these unseen things, start to recognize that they are there, and they are visible if we have opened our eyes to see them. Paul's point really is that in time, everything that is earthly, everything that is human, will crumble and will no longer exist as we know it. Cities will disappear, countries will disappear, homes and businesses will drift into history. Our own bodies, our own lives have a limit on this earth. And when you think about it that way, it's a little bit bleak. Why care about anything if the world as we know it will no longer exist one day? Why care for the bodies that God gave us if they are destined to disappear? Why care about anything if someday it will no longer exist? According to Paul, in spite of all of the decay of the world around us, there are invisible realities that we must live by if we are to retain our confidence and our strength in the future as individuals and as a community of faith. Moses said, "Show me your glory, I pray." And God said, "I will make my goodness pass before you." Sometimes I envy Moses. He would call to God and God would answer him, not with some sign, but with actual words. Maybe the words are there if we listen for them. But Paul encourages us. He says, don't look at the finite things in life, the perishable things of this world. Look toward the infinite things of God, the everlasting things of God's kingdom. Find hope in these eternal things, he says. Well, that's good, fine, and actually pretty great advice, but how do we focus on the eternal ways of God, the unseen things of God, when we are so surrounded by the regular visual things of life? What does Paul expect us to do? Shut our eyes to all that is happening around us? Does he want us to rely on the love of Christ that dwells within us to sustain us and ignore the world that God has placed us in? Is God in here or up there or all around? Where is God? I think Paul would say yes. Is God in me? Is God in heaven? Is God in the world or around the world? Yes, he would say. Paul would go like this. God is here, and God is here. He would say that the love of Christ dwells within each and every person, that the love of God dwells within our very beings. He would point to our hearts to answer the questions and point to the heavens to answer the same. There's an old story about a disciple and his teacher, and I think Paul would actually have really liked this story if it hadn't come thousands of years after his life. The disciple asks his teacher, "Where shall I find God?" "Here," the teacher says. "Then why can't I see God?" "Because you do not look," says the teacher. "But what should I look for?" the disciple says. "Nothing. Just look." "But look at what?" "At anything your eyes alight upon," the teacher says. "But must I look in a certain way?" "No, the ordinary way will do." "But don't I always look the ordinary way?" "No, you don't," says the teacher. "But why not?" the disciple asks. "Because," the teacher says, "to look, you must be here. You are mostly somewhere else." How often do we find ourselves missing out on what's happening right here because our minds are too busy trying to figure out something else? How often do you suppose we miss out on God's activity around us and in us and through us because we're too busy looking for signs of God's activity? To look, we must be here. But sometimes, too often perhaps, we are somewhere else. So imagine how different our lives of faith might be if we made a decision about who Jesus was based on the fact that he was born out of wedlock. Or imagine if we focused on the fact that he kept company with prostitutes and lepers and tax collectors. What if we let that define who we believe he is? Or what if we focused only on the fact that he died in one of the most shameful manners of his time? What if we let that define who he was? What if we were so busy looking at these facts that we couldn't actually see? Imagine if we looked at all of these seemingly shameful parts of his life and missed his true purpose. Amidst the bumps and the challenges of life and faith and ministry in this place, we stand with Paul and take comfort in knowing that Christ lives inside of us, that the presence of God is all around us, both internal and external. It is here and it is here. And you know what? If I had a third arm, I'd go like this. Though our outer nature is wasting away, which becomes more and more obvious, I think, as years go by. As our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. Because we live not by things that we can see, but by the things that are unseen. Because the things that are unseen are eternal, and love is one of them, and that never ends. So God renews us continually through Christ on the inside, and God works to bring about a new heaven and a new earth right in front of us at the same time. So our challenge today is to open our eyes to see and open our hearts to believe, and to be here, not somewhere else. Be here and look in the same ordinary way we've been looking, and be astounded by the things that we see. Thanks be to God. Amen.